Well, hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is TNC in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Deb Markowitz, the State Director of TNC in Massachusetts and your host for this event. Here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and globally using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for all, both people and the world. Today, we're bringing you along on a timely exploration of how plants and animals prepare for the winter. I know we're all getting ready for the cold weather. In fact, my furnace is on right now. So is nature around us. I hope many of you have been able to enjoy the fall foliage these last few weeks. It's been spectacular. Our conservation ecologist, Andy Finton, will be sharing some of the science behind these beautiful colors and the impacts of climate and weather on the display. Then our Western Massachusetts land steward, Rene Wendell, will walk us through some of the preparations creatures like birds, frogs, and mammals take to get ready for winter. So get your questions ready. Before we dive into the program today, I wanted to share a little bit about our guests, though I know many of you have met them before because they're frequent visitors to this webinar series. Andy is a conservation ecologist for the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts. His expertise is in forest ecology and landscape analysis. He works with land trusts, public agencies, academic partners to identify conservation priorities and to conserve important landscapes across New England. He's right now collaborating with Mass Wildlife on the upcoming iteration of Biomap, which is a conservation blueprint for the state of Massachusetts. And he contributed to the Nature Conservancy's resilient and connected landscape analysis, which we've talked about on previous webinars. That analysis identifies climate resilient sites across North America. Andy has a bachelor's in plant sciences from Cornell and a master's in forest ecology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And he's been with the Nature Conservancy for 22 years. Now to Rene. He's the son of a trapper, taxidermist, hunter, fisherman, and amateur entomologist. He never had a choice in life. He was always going to be an outdoorsman. He received his bachelor's degree from the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, and he worked for 13 years for the trustees as the property manager at the Bartholomew's Cobble. He currently works for the Nature Conservancy as a land steward in Western Massachusetts, where he helps manage close to 10,000 acres of preserves. He enjoys ice fishing, looking for arrowheads, bird watching, he's a great birder, and making dandelion salads. So as you think of questions for Andy and Rene during their presentation, please enter them below using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to them after the presentation. So thank you again so much for joining us, and let's dive in.
Great. Thank you, Deb. Lauren, I can't use my video, but I don't need it. I think we'll look mostly at slides anyway. But thank you, Deb, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's an honor and a pleasure to be presenting with Rene, which I've never done. And as Deb said, he and I are going to look behind the curtain and talk about how nature makes the transition from summer to winter, how plants and animals prepare to both survive and thrive through the winter. And forests and trees are my passion, as Deb mentioned, as is conserving them into the future. I spent the earlier part of my career in the forests of Massachusetts and the Catskills of New York and the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, and really got to feel and experience forests firsthand. Right now, most of my forests and fall color that I see is driving to and sitting on the sidelines of my daughter's soccer games. But that's actually a point that Rene and I both want to make, so I'll make it now and at the end, is that the key point is that we all get outside and experience nature and celebrate nature, especially at this time when it's so visually amazing. So as Deb mentioned, I'm going to focus on trees, woody plants that persist over the winter above ground. Certainly annual plants and perennial plants have their own strategies. Annuals die each year and overwinter as seeds. Perennial plants like the asters we're seeing now have stems and leaves that die back to the ground, but overwinter as roots underground. Now, trees have to live through the winter above ground, and they've developed some ingenious mechanisms to thrive in temperate areas and take full advantage of both warm summers and the freezing cold winters. Next slide, please, Lauren. So in the summer, trees put out leaves, which act, this is basically photosynthesis, which, whether we've remembered or not, we've probably all experienced it in grammar school at some point, elementary school. But trees put out leaves in the summer, which act as sugar factories. They pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it to sugar, carbohydrates. But leaves, especially the leaves of deciduous trees, are vulnerable to sub-freezing temperatures. They lose water through their leaves. So leaves, to bring in carbon dioxide to undertake photosynthesis from the atmosphere, they have tiny holes in them, tiny holes usually on the bottom side of the leaves, which when open, not only bring in carbon dioxide gas, but release water vapor. So when the ground is frozen, they can't take up additional water from the soil. So keeping those leaves and those openings would dry out the entire tree, likely killing it if they kept those leaves through the winter. Second, leaves have a lot of nutrients, and breaking them down and reabsorbing them into the trunk and the twigs and the roots builds the vitality and resilience of the tree. It would be a waste to keep those in the leaves and their valuable nutrients only to see them freeze and fall off in the winter. So they bring them back into the tree and store them for the winter and the next season. Trees intentionally and deliberately shut down for the winter. Next slide, please. So another ingenious method that trees and shrubs use to get a head start for next year and survive the winter is they produce buds that have all the leaves and flowers for next spring packed inside in a micro form. So next spring's buds are actually formed the previous summer. They're on there now. The buds for next year are on the trees right now. You can see them, especially as the leaves fall off. And for those who like to be a killjoy or a know-it-all, which I've been known to do, especially at least with my family, in the spring when people say to you, oh, the buds are out, you can actually say, well, actually, they've been there since last summer, because these buds are on the tree now. They formed last summer and they're ready. They've got the leaves and the flowers and the stems for next year packed inside those buds. And as an aside, buds and twigs are actually the most consistent and easiest way to identify trees and shrubs. They're more consistent and reliable than using the leaves. But most importantly for the tree is that buds protect the tiny leaves, twigs, and flowers from the cold and wind so they can grow the following spring. Now, Lauren, next slide. Yeah, so the leaves are actually attached below each bud. I'm pointing to the spot on the left of the red maple buds, and that area, I'll get wonky for a second, is called a leaf scar. It forms something in the fall called an abscission layer, the abscission of the leaf from the twig. So that thin layer of cells grows in the fall and allows the leaf to fall off the tree, to separate from the tree and fall to the ground. And that's true of all the buds we're seeing: red maple, sugar maple, red oak, three of the most common trees here in Massachusetts and southern New England. Next slide, please. So as we know, and as Deb mentioned, in preparation for the winter, the trees drop their leaves and turn beautiful colors. And this process of leaf color change, is triggered primarily by shortening day length. So that's a constant. It doesn't get affected by climate change. It appears it's year to year, the day length changes occur consistently. At this time, that triggers the breakdown of chlorophyll, the green pigment that absorbs light and is responsible for photosynthesis. Breaks down that green pigment, chlorophyll, in the cells and reabsorbs the nutrients from those cells, from those chlorophyll molecules, into the roots, twigs, and trunks. Now, underneath the green are yellow pigments, which are revealed when the chlorophyll breaks down. So that's kind of the default fall color. But when the conditions are right, some species produce new red pigments for maximum color. I'll get back to that color in a second, but next slide, please, Lauren. Another fun fact is that even evergreens, even pine trees lose their leaves each year. Needles are actually leaves. They're very narrow, specialized leaves. And conifers and evergreens change color and drop their leaves every year as well. You can see the yellow of this pine tree that I just took last week in my own neighborhood. So you might say, well, how are they evergreen if they lose their needles every year? If you look at the next slide, I've kind of diagrammed that out for you. What they do is they actually lose leaves that they produced 3 years ago. They keep the leaves they produced this year and last year and drop the leaves from 3 years ago. So on the right, we've got a twig and leaves, needles that were produced in this year. In the middle were last year's needles. And then on the left are the needles that were produced as the new twig way back in 2020. And those are the ones that turn yellow and fall to the ground and that we get to crunch underfoot this year. And pine needles are just one example of specialization. They can last the winter because of their narrow, low surface area and a very waxy coating that helps them prevent them from drying out. Now, looking at the next slide, the ideal fall color results from very specific conditions. Ideally, ample rain in the spring and summer, followed by bright, crisp, sunny days in the 60s or so, and cool nights in the 50s and sometimes even the upper 30s, above freezing. Pretty much like what we've been experiencing today, the last couple days, and actually the last few weeks. This allows the leaves to produce more sugars, which leads to the development of a red pigment called anthocyanin. And that red pigment adds to the inherent or default yellow colors to bring us these beautiful oranges and reds. Now, there's already a lot of variability in precipitation and temperature patterns year over year. Climate change is just acting to exacerbate that variability and produce more extremes, leading to even more variability and extremes in the fall foliage season in terms of timing and the quality of color. In general, leaf change and fall foliage are moving later. I've read one report that said up to 4 days per decade over the last couple decades. And this largely comes from warmer temperatures in the late summer and fall, early fall, that delay that breakdown of chlorophyll. The tree wants to maximize its photosynthesis, produce as much sugars, and then begin that breakdown of chlorophyll until a later date. Now, this year we've seen just the opposite. Next slide, please. Where the drought has had the opposite effect. It's accelerated some fall color change by stressing the trees, stressing the leaves, and encouraging them to close up shop early. I took this picture just a couple weeks ago in central Massachusetts, where the sugar maple that usually looks like it did on the previous slide had turned yellow and brown instead of beautiful oranges, and has withered before they reach that maximum color and are falling to the ground. Now we're still seeing a bunch of great fall color around, and we see some great yellows and golds, but there's still good oranges and reds, often in the lower elevations, wetter areas we call microclimates, where the impact of drought is lessened. Different species respond differently to drought and to weather conditions and climatic changes. And I've also heard that the drought we're here in Eastern Mass, but the drought is less so in Central and Western Mass and also in Northern New England. So I've had a few opportunities, next slide please, Lauren, to talk about fall color and the impacts of climate change in a variety of news outlets in the past couple years, this fall and last. And at first I thought to myself, well, this is kind of a fluffy piece and it's interesting and fun. But then I started realizing the relevance of these stories to the conservation work we do every day and to our everyday lives. And I thought more about it, and the phenomenon of fall color really has personal, economic, and ecological impacts. So economically, fall color accounts for, I've read a few different numbers, but at a minimum, $3 billion of tourism in New England each year. But I've also read up to $8 billion, and then I've read state by state accounts that each state, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, claiming about $4 to $5 billion every year. So the numbers are high for tourism economy in New England from fall color. Now, ecologically, we could spend a lot of time talking about forest health and forest resilience, and I would love to do that, but we'll see, if your questions direct us that way. But in the meantime, fall color isn't necessarily a quantitatively measured indicator of forest health, but I really see it as a sign of how well our forests are thriving or struggling, how resilient they are. And then personally, we've talked about this, and Rene will talk about this, but we're in the season right now, and I think almost everyone can say that being in New England in this time of year, they've been inspired in some way by what our New England trees and forests do in the fall, whether it's a single street tree or the vast forested landscapes of New England. And that's a good reminder to me to mention the benefits we get from trees and forests, which we can take for granted throughout the year. But this is the perfect time to take notice and appreciate our forests. Forests pull carbon from the atmosphere and store it for centuries. They filter our drinking water. They reduce heat island effects in cities and communities. And they provide us all with health and well-being, as well as providing habitat for literally thousands of plant and animal species in Massachusetts alone. But the flip side of that is that climate change, along with habitat loss, invasive species, insects, forest diseases, are challenging the viability of our forests. We lose about 5,000 acres of forests a year to development. That's a football field every couple hours, 24/7, 365 days a year. And my conservation message, with the next slide, please, is that we can help our forests to stay resilient. They're inherently resilient. And if we continue, we want to continue to see this fall display and all the benefits that forests provide, we need to give them a little help and a little leg up. A couple real simple things we can do is we can reduce carbon emissions to mitigate climate change. And the Nature Conservancy, for example, supports policy and science that greatly expand renewable energy in Massachusetts and beyond. And we can conserve intact and resilient forests. Our native forests, as I said, are inherently resilient, and they need our help to maintain this precious resource and all the benefits they provide to both species and us. So I'm going to close and hand it over to Rene with just I created 5 simple rules for enjoying the fall season. The first is there always will be fall color. It may vary quite a bit in terms of timing and quality, but it's always going to be amazing, inspiring, and spectacular. So get outside. Look for microclimates. In this picture, this is early fall in the Berkshires. This is where Rene gets to work. I'm behind my desk, but this is where Rene works, and he'll tell us more about that. But look for you notice that the fall color is in the lower areas along the edges of wetlands. So look for places that might be moister in a dry year and other climates, other sub areas of the landscape. Pay attention to where these are, and you'll find some increased fall color there. My third rule is the next slide, is to make sure to look down, not just up, because the understory, whether it's ferns or wildflowers, or shrubs in this case, or vines, can also provide amazing fall color. The picture on the right is a high bush blueberry shrub just a couple weeks ago. And also just a couple weeks ago, some of you may recognize this picture, of which, despite its bad reputation, poison ivy produces an awesome fall color. One more rule is the next slide. And I almost titled it, "It's the Oaks, Stupid," but that's a little, didn't need to go there. But wait for the oaks, because the oaks turn color just a couple weeks after our maples and our birches, and produce beautiful oranges and purples and maroons, burgundies, and tan colors. And they're a dominant species: red oak, black oak, pin oak, white oak, and a few other oak species, predominant species in Massachusetts, southern New England, that are really worth seeing, starting now right into early November. My final rule, as I've said more than once, is get out, enjoy, renew, and celebrate nature. Thanks for your time. I look forward to your questions. I do feel like we've saved the best for last, and with that, I'll turn it over to Rene.
All right, Lauren. That was awesome, Andy. I didn't actually know about the 3-year cycle on pine needles, so that was quite awesome. And I would say that it's an honor for me to be on a conversation on a webinar with you as a conservation ecologist. Just incredible people I get to work with the Nature Conservancy. So I was invited to talk a little bit about animals and how animals prepare for the winter. So there's a few types of dormancy. You think about, bears being the big one. There's hibernation, there's long-term, sleep all through the winter. Think woodchuck, maybe a bat, morning cloak butterflies, crawl up under bark and sleep the winter away. There's diapause, kind of what some insects do and how they, overwinter in their life stages. Think like eggs, the spongy moth eggs on the bark. The scourge, they're overwintering, come out next year, or like a cocoon, like a moth in a cocoon. There's brumation, which ectotherms do, reptiles and amphibians who get their energy from an outside source like the sun, or in a turtle's case, water. I have torpor down on my list here, but that's kind of like a hibernation. That's kind of what bears and chipmunks do. That's they sleep the winter, but they wake up occasionally, so it's not a true hibernator. There's estivation, which I'm not going to talk about. That has to do more in hot, dry climates where it's too hot and dry, or there's no water, and animals have to survive throughout the drought and the summer season. So I guess we can start some clips, Lauren, or some photos. The wood frog. Oh man, love this animal. This animal is absolutely crazy. This animal is an ectotherm. All right, it's gonna sleep throughout the winter. And it does it by almost completely freezing solid. You've got to have heard about this by now with this crazy animal. It's about as close to death as you can possibly get. Its heart completely stops. So what it does is it tries to get as much water out of its extremities as it possibly can, out of its cells, brings some of that water close to its internal organs, and then floods its entire system with sugar, with glucose, which acts as a type of antifreeze to protect it from freezing. And then as it gets warmer, it thaws out, its heart starts beating again. Absolutely crazy. Watch some YouTube videos on this guy. It's really neat. So we can do the next animal we got. The chickie, that's a great photo. None of these are my photos, unfortunately. But Lauren was kind enough to pull them from stock photos. Chickadee, that's my favorite bird. They don't wimp out and head south for the winter. They stick it out, enjoy the Berkshires and Massachusetts all winter long. They're well insulated. Look at that puffy like feathers it's got there. It keeps active all day and it keeps its body temperature at night. But at night, they lower their body temperature, all right, to protect themselves from freezing. And if it's really cold, chickadees go into a controlled state of hypothermia. So their body starts shivering, and they shiver all night, all right? And to do this, they have to burn up their fat to do it, right? So they can use up to 10%, even more of the body fat that they have within them. So then they wake up the next day, and that's when they go crazy and have to gather seeds and put that 10% of their body weight in fat back in there so that they can survive the next night. Chickadees can store up to like 1,000 seeds a day. All right. And to do this and to remember where they put all their seeds in autumn, right now, the chickadees, the part of the chickadee's brain that is responsible for memory, the hippocampus, actually grows 30% larger in the winter than it is in the summer because it needs this ability to remember where it puts all its seeds. So that's why chickadees are so active throughout the day. It's your black oil sunflower seed feeders. Who we got next, Lauren? Painted turtles. These guys are crazy. So if you think about these turtles, right, they're spending 3 to 4 months underneath the ice, underwater. Why do they do it in water, right? So water, temperature wise, is more stable than the air, right? The temperature of water is going to stay relatively constant, whereas it could be 0 to 40 degrees on any given day in the Berkshires. We all know this, right? So they go completely underwater. All right. They can lower their metabolism down by 95%. Early in the season, you can see them under the ice. Sometimes they're moving through the ice, and you can see them. But lots of times, they just totally burrow in the mud. And what they do is cloacal breathing. So how do they breathe underwater, right? So this is crazy, right? So right now they're breathing air, right? They're out of that water. But underwater, they do cloacal breathing. That means that they absorb oxygen directly through their skin. So they'll do it through their skin, they'll open their mouth, they'll absorb it through their mouth, and they'll also through it, their coica, their bum. So that's how they'll get their oxygen, right? So underwater, there's a lot of dissolved oxygen within a cold environment, right? But because the turtle has slowed its metabolism down, sometimes up to 90%, right? It's not burning, fat, right? It takes energy and heat to burn off calories, right? So what they do is they convert energy, and they break down glycogen in their system, right? And that comes from the liver. But to do this, when they break that down, there's a lot of lactic acid that builds up in their system, right? So to counterbalance the lactic acid in their system, they change their body chemistry, right? And they actually borrow nutrients to balance this body chemistry from their shell and from their skeleton. Migrating shorebirds and migrating birds will do this too. They'll actually use nutrients from their organs and in the case of this turtle, they'll use it from their skeleton and their shell. So pretty awesome. The painted turtle. All right, who we got next? We must be wrapping it up. The black bear. Awesome. So it's, you got a hibernation. You can't have a hibernation talk without a bear, right? They're not true hibernators. They go into what's called the torpor. So they sleep for a little bit, 3 or 4 days. They wake up, sometimes if it's even warm enough, they'll go outside and look for food. They don't really decrease their metabolism that much. So in their little hiding place underneath a tree, in a cave, in a big tangle of bushes, they still have to burn calories. So they're living off their fat reserves. All right. But when they're doing this, they don't need to urinate. They don't need to, relieve themselves at all too. So they do a lot of recycling, right? So the urine that they make while they're doing all this is actually recycled. And the nitrogen that is recycled through their system is used to build protein. So that helps the bear come out and still be a big muscular beast of an animal that, bears need to be. So they're not breaking down muscle mass to get them through the winter. They're just completely using their stored fat. I think we must be getting close. One more. Chipmunk. All right. Look at that guy. I can't even stand it. Too cute. So they're similar to bears, right? I mean, not in size, obviously, but they sleep. there you have a torpor, right? So think of these guys right now. They store their food, right? So they don't get a lot of fat like a bear. What they do is they fill those cheeks up with a bunch of nuts and berries and whatever they can bring underground, and they make a humongous larder, which they sleep on, right? So they have this bedroom chamber filled with nuts and berries and stuff, and they wake up every few days and they eat, and then they even have to relieve themselves. They don't build up a fecal plug like a bear does. They will actually have a nice little chamber where they go and they relieve themselves. So I don't know. I just think that's crazy. I don't know why it ends up this way. But that's the guys I had to talk about.
All right, let's see. I'm going to come back on. Why don't we get us all on screen and we'll have a little conversation. That was really fabulous, both of you. I learned a lot about trees that I thought I already knew a lot about why our trees turn color, but really fascinating. And Rene, I always love hearing you talk about nature and telling us fun and sometimes kind of, facts that maybe aren't dinner table conversation, but certainly make the kids in my life giggle. So we've got a bunch of audience questions. And for those of you who have questions, and I would encourage you to enter them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to them all. So I mentioned, let's start with this one. I mentioned, I noticed that you just touched lightly on insects. And how do these small creatures overwinter? What do insects do? Is it all different? Is there some common themes? I'm always surprised that like the first warm day in spring, it seems like something hatches and there are little flies everywhere. And, what can you tell us about that, Rene?
Yeah, so I was told I could be able to turn on my video. I don't know how to do this. Anyway,
So maybe Lauren can do that for you.
Yeah. So insects run the gambit, right? So some insects migrate, think about monarch butterflies and the big clouds of dragonflies. So some will migrate to warmer climes. I spoke about diapause, the way that insects will hold off their life cycle and stay within the egg stage or the pupa stage underneath the leaves, or in a cocoon. Then you have hibernators, and it's crazy to think that actually a butterfly will hibernate, but our mourning cloaks and our commas and question marks will get up tucked underneath some loose bark and spend the winter there. If people want to know what they can do for themselves, like how to help animals, sometimes it's not the best thing to feed animals. Like there's problems associated with that, unless it's chickadees and black oil sunflowers. But insects, like everybody needs insects, and birds eat insects, right? So I no longer clean up around my house anymore in the fall. It's all the leaves are there. All the brush and the old stems of all the flowers and stuff that I have, I leave until the spring. I don't even do my compost heap anymore because there's a ton of insects in my compost heap. So I will just do my compost heap in the spring. Yeah. So there's some things you can do, don't mow and stuff like that to protect the insects.
Yeah, that's great. I know we leave our leaves out, not all of them, like at the right front of our house, right by the road. We'll do the leaves because of the neighbors, but the rest of it, we just leave them over the winter, which may be why we get those big hatches, is because they've really found homes there. We got a question that was actually submitted ahead of time from Bill Fleming, and he asks about how the soil biology behaves during the winter. And this is probably for Andy. Since trees are moving sugars and other nutrients into their roots for storage during the winter, are those interacting with or being used by the fungi and bacteria in the soil? And it's many people on here may know that there's this incredible network of fungus network in the soils that connect our trees in a way that we're just learning more and more about every year.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. That's absolutely right. And that goes on year round, and especially in the summer when there's so much happening, that connection between the fungal network and the roots of trees that are mutually supportive, and the sugars that are produced by the trees supporting the fungi, which can't make their own sugars. I don't know specifically whether the relative rates in the winter, but my guess is that everything slows down in the winter. So with frozen soils, with the tree not producing as much sugars, I think there's still the connection, but my guess is that everything is slowed down and there's very little bit of that connection through the winter. That would be my best guess.
Thank you. We have a question from Mary Larson. It was a question I actually was thinking about as well. It was news to me that pine trees lose their, the 3-year needles. And the question was, do they replace those 3-year-old needles they dropped in the same place where those needles were on the branch, or only add to the end of the branch or the twig as it grows?
Yeah, good question. It's the latter. They only add new leaves to the twig. The bud at the very tip expands and produces leaves, but that 3-year-old branch is now getting fatter and fatter. It's not going to produce any more leaves, but it's going to start to get thicker and thicker bark that you associate with the pine tree. So yeah, no more leaves back in that older branch. They're all coming out on the tips.
We have another tree question. Bill Fleming noted that in Central Virginia, he and others have noticed a huge increase in the number of acorns and other tree nuts falling now. What's the cause of this high production of tree nuts? And let me mention that after there's a high production of tree nuts, you're going to see a lot more chipmunks. So beware, chipmunks and squirrels and mice, all the things that like to live on them. They'll have more robust nests, and you'll have a boon year for these little animals that can be pests.
Right, perfect, Deb. Because I was going to say the same thing. Because I'll answer the question, but then I bet Rene has some thoughts on what's known as a mast year. So this cumulative production of acorns, sometimes walnuts and hickories, is called mast, M-A-S-T, and it's the collective production of these tree nuts that are critical for wildlife, not only small mammals like Deb mentioned, but birds and even bears, and can affect the survival and the reproductive success of animals large and small. But you see it quite frequently. It's both genetically imprinted that there'll be strong years and weak years in trees like oaks and walnuts and beech and hickories, but also it's very affected by the weather. So a bad year, a drought year, could be expect a weaker season next year. An early frost can reduce a season, and all the trees tend to do it at once. So it's not just tree by tree, it tends to be cumulative across all the trees of a similar species in that forest. But when it happens, yes, it feels like it's raining acorns. And I know it because there's a walnut tree. I'm literally looking at it right now behind my house, and it's right over my neighbor's garage. And every other year, those walnuts fall and make a lot of drumming sounds. But it's pretty much been every other year, not every year since I've been here. But that's a mast year you're experiencing in Virginia, with a universal production of heavy production of acorns by your oaks.
Let me just add before we get to Rene. I had heard a theory that the mass year relates sometimes with the cicada year. So there's a cicada year, and then 2 years later, a year later, there's a mass year because of all the extra nutrients in the soil. Am I making that up, or did you hear something like that? Is it logical at least?
That's for me. That's going to be a Google search, unless Rene knows about it.
Don't know if there's a correlation, but there's actually a term for it, and I should have looked on my phone while I had my video off. I just figured out how to get on my video. So basically, Andy's incredible. He's so right? So the trees all do it at one time. They don't know how they do that. Are they communicating through their roots? Is there some sort of communication like, hey, this is the year we're going to do a giant mast year? And the way this works, right, is you put so many acorns on the ground, right, that all the animals that would eat them are sated, right? It's the same thing with cicadas, right? so many cicadas come out all at once that the skunk can't possibly eat another cicada. So all those other cicadas that are left get to breed. So squirrels they can't help themselves. They bury nuts constantly. And if they're burying so many nuts, they can't possibly find all the ones they buried in a mass year. And that's how the little trees survive. But the trees don't even know how the trees are communicating. It's amazing.
We have a question now about fish from Rana Erickson. Fish, do they survive just by torpor under the ice? I know my goldfish just sit at the bottom for the most part and don't eat anything until the water's above 45 degrees.
So fish are crazy, right? So fish don't care. They don't, but some fish will slow down, right? So some fish will go down to the bottom of the lake are less active, but some fish are more active, right? Knowing that some of their the fish that they're preying on are inactive. So fish like the big fish that need to eat a lot of little fish, like pike and bass and stuff. That's why there's a lot of ice fishermen out there.
Yeah, because it's so rewarding. You just dip and grab.
Right. And fish don't care for the most part, but I don't know about your goldfish. Maybe that's I don't know, Rana. That's a crazy question. I should have known that question.
So we have a question from Mary Pelletier for, I think, probably for Andy. Increasing heat increases evaporation. How can we protect dense shade beneath layered, mature, intact forest tree canopies and strengthen grown cover vegetation like ferns and other perennials that prefer shade?
You're definitely right. And, for those of us who have had the pleasure of walking in really old or old growth forests, it's definitely a different experience with the amount of big trees, dense understory, sometimes dead trees that are standing up, dead trees on the ground. Sometimes it's so hard to walk. We tend to visually appreciate clean forest, but a messy forest is the best forest. And so I think what this question may be getting at is that if we allow a lot of our forests to get to this stage where they're messy and old and have a lot of downed wood and build up dense soil and litter and duff on the forest floor, the leaves and the decomposing leaves, that's going to hold a lot more moisture in it than a clean and tidy forest where there aren't many dead trees on the ground. There's not as much leaf litter or duff, which is the decomposing leaves below the litter. So yeah, old dense forests hold on to a lot of moisture, and we're working to encourage a lot of that condition across the landscape in Massachusetts and New England.
That's great. Jeff Tandle also asked a question back to Rene. I think having heard about the birds' hippocampuses enlarging so they can remember where they stashed all their seeds. He heard that squirrels do the same thing to help recall the location of food stashes. Is this true? Or
yes, I do believe it is. So it's all about memory, right? You got to remember where you buried 700. Like I said, the chickadee can hide 1,000 a day. That's
wow.
Nuts. How do you remember that? So
that is crazy.
Yeah. So I have heard that squirrels. It's true with squirrels as well.
Do you think that would work for us too? If we practice, if we stash our food and try to remember where it is, will we preserve our memories a little better by growing our hippocampuses?
Who knows what 300 years will bring with science? It would be amazing. I don't even remember what I had for breakfast.
I know. As I'm getting older, it's like, what's that person's name? I know them. Susan Parmenter asks, just curious, any comments or news on ticks? We've been overwhelmed here in New Hampshire in the spring and summer with both wood ticks and now tons of deer ticks. Are milder winters just going to keep making it easier for them to survive? It's a sad story.
Rene, do you have thoughts?
I'll let you take it if you want.
Okay.
I don't want to be a bad guy.
Um, as far as I know, the more mild the winters, which we're experiencing more of, the more ticks we're going to have, and that's challenging and unfortunate. There is a correlation too to those mast years, like Deb was saying. When there's good production of acorns, you get more mice, which are a host for the ticks, and then more ticks and more Lyme disease. So, but yeah, I always enjoy those really bitter cold portions of the winter, even though we curse under our breath sometimes about it, but we know that the ticks and some other non-native insect species that feed on trees are getting knocked back. So enjoy those bitter cold days in January and February if they come, because we know they're controlling our pests.
Yeah, I also had heard that part of the problem is the shortening of the season, the fact that spring arrives earlier and winter arrives later, which allows them to have more time to do all the different feedings they need to do for their full life cycle. And so the hard frost, like the really deep winter cold spells, are matter, but it's actually that shrinking of seasons that are operative. And so, yes, the answer unfortunately is yes. And luckily they're now, they have a vaccine that they're trying out. And I know one of our staff members are in the study trying to see if we couldn't end up being able to resolve Lyme's disease, which I know is just a terrible, terrible disease, through a vaccination. We have.
Let me jump in
Oh,
there
yes,
too.
jump in, please.
Ticks are here to stay, and a lot of people don't realize it, but there's like a second hatch. So you get a flush early in summer, but now you're getting more ticks.
Yeah.
So
And this-
don't be complacent. Don't go out there and be like, tick season's over. This is another big hatch right now. So
And this is what I mean by the cycle that happens on both ends. So this hatch has more opportunity if we don't have those significant cold, the cold weather. If it pushes off till November, they get more time to feed. And anyway, we have lots of questions I want to make sure we get to. There's a question, another bug question. How do any adult mantids survive New England's winter? Is it just survival by egg case? And if you could also differentiate between native and non-native mantids, and you'll have to say what is a mantid.
praying mantis.
Oh, is that what they're looking at?
Yeah.
Oh, it probably is just a praying mantis there.
I don't believe that the adults survive the winter. So a lot of insects will actually die. So insects as a general rule don't have a very long life stage as an adult. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, but I think it's strictly in the egg case that comes out. And I think the majority of the mantids we have are not native. I know the big, huge one, that's the Chinese one. Andy, do we have native mantids? I don't think we do.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know, Rene.
Yeah, that is a good question. I don't know that, but I think about it, right? So have you ever seen a praying mantis in the spring? It's usually in the fall, is when you start to see them, or in the late summer. So I don't believe that the adults survive the winter now.
There was a question about native birds in the Berkshires and whether they store food over the summer for winter consumption.
Summer is more along the lines of feeding the young that you've already had, so you've got begging chicks.
Yeah.
So I don't think so. I think maybe a fall. I think it's a fall thing.
Rene, what do you know about blue jays? Because they take acorns and stash them, but I don't know.
There you go.
Yeah.
There's one. And the acorn woodpecker out west will start stashing all those. Yeah. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Blue jay.
So Rana Erickson notes that Carolina mantis is native. So
Sure.
Thank you for, I don't know if you just knew that or if you did a quick search for us.
Nice. The big one, that big one's a Chinese one. I know that one. Yeah.
So Mary Pelletier says, I heard that mast years correlate to droughts and that the increased production of seed is to support regeneration. Does that sound familiar?
There's when I see a tree or a shrub that's fruiting heavily, there's two reasons. One, it's really healthy, and two, it's really stressed. Because a stressed tree will say, I'm not going to make it, but I'm going to make a lot of babies. So sometimes a stress event like a drought can produce a lot of seeds in a tree or a shrub. So that makes sense. I don't know the direct correlation to drought in mast years, but it does make sense from that perspective.
Michael Perloff asks, and this is a good question, I wondered this myself, what happens to beavers in the winter? And what happens to beavers when summer drought evaporates their ponds?
So beavers don't hibernate. They live underneath the ice. So they're up in their lodge, tucky tucked, and in the fall, they will be putting sticks. They'll drag them into the pond and drag them into the mud where they'll go underneath, out through their lodge and then grab a stick and eat the cambium layer. In the summer, they just eat, herbaceous material. They don't need to eat cambium, so they're eating grasses and sedges and stuff because they're a vegetarian. If something happens to their pond, they'll just migrate. They'll find a wetland that's suitable, and sometimes it can be tough. We're getting critical mass for beavers, so beaver just can't move on to another territory that's already occupied by a beaver. You get a lot of fighting and stuff like that. So hopefully, if a pond dries up, that they can find another place to live. But sometimes they'll have to travel a long way to do it, and in which case it puts them vulnerable to probably their biggest predator would be the coyote.
That's interesting. Beavers are complicated animals when we think about, land management and stewardship, because they really can destroy ecosystems by creating their new ecosystem, right? They pond things up, and it's not just roads. I know we think of them in their nuisance form when they're creating their ponds and it washes out roads or takes out land. But when and part of the good thing about coyotes coming back is that they can help create some balance where we have an overpopulation of beavers. We have a question about trees, and this is actually a really interesting question that I have wondered. Is there a reason for why different sections of a tree or a plant will change colors at different times? Like you'll come and you'll see green on part of it and yellow on part of it and orange. And does it start from the top usually, like changing colors? Is there a rhyme or reason to it?
There is rhyme and reason, Deb. I was just thinking about that this morning when I was walking the dog and I saw that phenomenon. It's really about sunlight. So what part of the tree is getting sunlight? Because I mentioned that's a trigger for the production of these redder colors. And so the shadier portions of a tree, whether it's the lower portions or the north side of a tree, are going to get less sunlight than other portions. And it's that sunlight that triggers those transitions, the breakdown of chlorophyll and the development of the red pigments.
Just so you know, we have a couple of fans who think you should be doing these presentations to school kids, which bravo, the two of you are so interesting. And there's a question, Rene, is there anything we do as we manage our preserves to help nature prepare for winter?
The preserves themselves, it's all about resiliency, right? So, Andy loves that word. I love it too. So try to keep in our preserves as healthy as they possibly can. A lot of stuff is outside our control, but we love beavers if we can. And in some places we can't have beavers because of rare species and they flood out, calcareous fens. But invasive species are a scourge, wherever there's, a barberry bush, there's very few overwintering insects. The berries will be eaten by grouse, but that just perpetuates the problem. So getting rid of these invasive species, probably our top, my top way of making them more resilient. Yeah. But Andy and the science department have been looking at how to increase the resiliency for climate change on some of our preserves. Like, is this tract of land, if we add it to this preserve, does this, help with migration of, plants and animals as they move farther north? Maybe you want to speak to it too, Andy.
Well, I'll be mindful of time, but I'll just add that that's exactly right, Rene, that we're looking at the same thing Rene described at much larger landscape scales to identify resilient places that accomplish all the things we've talked about today, keeping more moisture in the forest, providing options to species like the beaver that can move to the adjacent wetland because there is one there. So conserving big, intact, resilient landscapes, rivers, wetlands, forests, coastlines is a great strategy to help plants and animals survive winter.
One of the things that we're particularly lucky about in Massachusetts is how many partners we have who are doing this work, whether it's like BNRC out in the Berkshires or the Mass Audubon or the hundreds of local land trusts we have here are really important partners. And I just want to give a little shout out to some work that I mentioned earlier on that Andy's been involved with, which is creating the biomap, and that it really maps out where these connections can really make a difference. And our hope is that it's a roadmap, not just for our partners, but for state government as they make critical decisions about how to spend money on the ground to protect the landscape. I want to thank both of you. You're both so good. I just love being on these webinars with you. It's amazing how much I learn each time. And I know the folks who've been listening would agree. I want to also thank everyone who has joined us for this webinar. It is your support of the Nature Conservancy that makes all of our work possible. So thank you very much. We're going to be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days that'll have links to the resources we talked about today, as well as the recording of this webinar, which feel free to share with friends and family you think would enjoy this information, including the children in your lives. Feel free to also follow us on social media, conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram. It's a way to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect. Please stay tuned for more webinars coming later this fall. We're going to be sending out more information soon, and you can check for updates on our website, nature.org/MA webinars. Thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Andy.